Hi everyone, I'm going to talk to you quickly about cutting fabric, square, straight, and on grain. So I'm going to tell you quickly what it means to be on grain, why it's so important to cut on grain, and then I'm going to take you to my table and show you how I cut on grain, what I've found is the most effective way to make sure that you're cutting on grain. So when we talk about being on grain, we're referring to fabric that is woven on a loom. So when threads or yarns are set up on a loom, the warp thread, which is the lengthwise thread, is set on the loom. And then the weft thread, which is the crosswise thread, so they run perpendicular to each other. The warp is lengthwise and the weft is selvage to selvage, basically, or left to right, is woven into the warp threads. And they're perpendicular to each other or at a right angle to each other. So these threads are essentially they're the grains. That's what that means. So why is it important to cut on grain? So it's important to cut on grain because you will eliminate time and frustration, for one. And your projects will be straight, square, hang properly, sit properly, fit properly. So everybody's worn a shirt where the side seam doesn't hang straight down the side of your body. It wants to kind of come around the front of your body. That's a result of that garment not being cut on grain. Or a pair of pants where that center seam wants to pull around the front of your leg. That's because that pant leg was not cut on grain. In home decor sewing, if you're making a set of drapes, you might have, after you hung your drapes, they may not reach the floor straight, and you know that you cut them this exact same dimensions left to right. That could be because your fabric is stretching oddly because your fabric was not straight on the grain. So that's one reason. So those are a couple reasons why it's so important. I have actually cut square pillows that I thought I cut perfectly square, and I wasn't paying attention to the grain. And when I made the pillow and had it on my couch for a while, the pillows get unsquare, they get wonky, and that's because the fabric wasn't initially cut on grain. So I'm going to show you real quick some samples a couple samples of the grain of fabric. So this is a burlap, and I picked this one out of my stash because it's super easy to see the grains of this fabric, or in this fabric. So this is the selvage edge right here, and the warp is running up and down or lengthwise, and then the weft is left to right, selvage to selvage. And so you can see the grains in this. It's real easy to see them crisscrossing each other, basically at right angles to each other. I mean, it's a very loose weave, so some of it's a little bit curvy and not completely straight, but you can see the grains of that pretty easily. And then I have this is actually a hemp fabric. This is actually an Ikea hemp fabric. You can see the grains on this one as well. Obviously this one's a way tighter weave, but you can still see them there. And that's why this method I'm going to show you is so important, because with this fabric, it's such a tight weave that you would have a very hard time knowing for sure if you're cutting this on grain if you don't use this method, this pull the string method. So I'm going to take you to the table now and show you quickly how to go about cutting on the grain. Okay, so here we are at my cutting table. I've got the burlap laid out on the table. I wanted to touch on one thing real quick that I didn't talk about over there at the sewing machine, and that is patterned fabric. Fabric that's got the pattern, a woven pattern. So the pattern is actually woven and not printed on the fabric. So this is obviously a plaid, and when you have a pattern, you can really just cut right along the pattern. That makes cutting your fabric square very easy when you have a pattern. With this, obviously, you would just follow right along the edge of that red line or black line, and you know your fabric is going to be square. If you had a floral pattern, let's say, and there's a flower, 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 you would just cut right along the same flower with every pattern repeat, and you would know that your fabric is going to be square and on grain. So patterned fabric is cutting it is a lot easier. But going back to a solid fabric, you can see it would be difficult to cut this on grain for sure. And now I don't know where my scissors went. Okay, so now I've got my scissors. So the way that I do this, and I'm going to show you real quick the way that I cut this. So you're going to cut into the selvage and into the actual fabric by about 1/4 inch. You're going to pull that apart and coax out a thread. So you see, I coaxed out that single thread. I'm going to grab a hold of that thread and pull this fabric to gather it up. You're basically pulling one thread out of the weave. And you see it's very easy on this burlap because the burlap is a real, it's got real fat threads, strong, so it's easy to pull those threads right out of there. So you pull it out of the weave, flatten it back out, and there you can see the missing thread. And it looks like I must have already cut this one on grain because it's pretty square. So you see there's the missing thread. Then I would just go and cut right on that missing thread line. And you know for sure that this is straight and square, and you can start you did a poor job cutting that. It's straight and square, and you can start your project from here, and you know that this is going to be a nice square cut. And here we have the hemp, which you can obviously see this is way tighter of a grain. So this one I've already snipped into the selvage and pulled it apart and grabbed my thread, and I'll gather this one and try not to break the thread as I go across. If you do break the thread as you go across, no big deal. You just coax out the thread next to the one you were pulling, and that's just fine. You'll pull out, see, like that broke. But look, I'm almost all the way across this. So if you just continue to pull that thread, it'll pull it right out, and there you have a very clear line of where you're missing that single grain, and that's the line you're going to cut on, and then this will be on the straight of the grain. So that is how I do it. That's how I make sure that all my fabrics when I'm starting a project are cut straight, and it's very important that you do this. This is the first thing that you do before you start a project, because when you get fabric from the fabric store, they have it on the bolt folded in half, like, you know, like this, so it'll fit on the bolt. It'll roll on the bolt. And they don't make sure that that first cut that they give you is square. And when it's rolled on the bolt, it's oftentimes folded, not square on the grain. So when you get it home, it often looks very nice and flat, and it looks like the selvages line up well and that it's perfectly square, but 9 times out of 10, it's not. So you want to open up your fabric and pull a thread to make sure that that first cut is square. And if you're going to be washing the garment or whatever it is that you're making, if you're washing it, then you probably want to wash your fabric and dry it before you even start your project. That will kind of reset the grains too. And then from there, cut your first cut square. So anyway, that's how I do it. That's the whole process of what it means to cut on grain and how I go about cutting on grain. So thanks for watching, you guys. It's Mimsy from Mimsy & Company. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.